Lucius Cornelius Sulla was not born a monster. He was born Roman, but somewhere between ambition and bloodlust. He became something else entirely, something that would make even the cruelest generals in history pause. In the beginning, Sulla was underestimated. He was charming, educated, and fluent in Greek. People thought of him as too refined for war, too clever to be cruel. But Rome had a way of revealing what lurked beneath a man's skin, and in Sulla-esque's case, what lay underneath was fire and steel. His first true taste of power came during the Social War, a brutal conflict between Rome and its former Italian allies. These allies had fought and bled for Rome for generations, but were denied citizenship. When they finally rose up, Sulla didn't just crush them, he humiliated them. He marched on their cities, executed leaders in public, and sent survivors home with scars as warnings. His cruelty wasn't just punishment, it was policy. But the Social War was just a rehearsal. When Sulla was appointed to lead a campaign against Mithridates VI of Pontus, an Eastern king who dared challenge Roman supremacy, everything changed. The Senate agreed he was the man for the job, but politics in Rome were venomous. Another general, Gaius Marius Sulla's bitter rival, wanted that glory for himself, and so Rome made a mistake that would change its fate forever. It stripped Sulla of his command and gave it to Marius. Sulla did something no Roman general had ever dared to do. He turned his army, not on a foreign enemy, but on Rome itself. Sulla marched his legions across the sacred boundary of the city, something considered blasphemous. The Senate panicked. Streets ran red as citizens scattered, soldiers burned homes and temples were defiled. This wasn't just civil war, it was Rome devouring itself. When he had taken back control, Sulla didn't stop at vengeance. He invented a terrifying new system called proscription, posted lists of names, senators, equestrians, even ordinary citizens, who were declared enemies of the state. Anyone could kill them. In fact, they were rewarded for doing so. Heads were displayed in the forum, entire families wiped out, fortunes stolen, and Rome learned a new word: terror. Then Sulla finally went east to fight Mithridates. And if Rome had feared him before, the East would soon know what true horror meant. In Greece, he laid siege to Athens. The ancient city, birthplace of democracy and philosophy, held out bravely. Sulla didn't care. He cut down forests, melted holy relics for coin, and starved the people. When the city fell, his troops stormed in like wolves. Blood soaked the marble, statues were shattered, libraries burned, and the streets echoed with screams. But Sulla was not done. He chased Mithridates across the region, fighting battles that left thousands dead. One such clash, the Battle of Chaeronea, was a masterpiece of slaughter. Sulla's army, though outnumbered, annihilated the enemy. He left the battlefield littered with corpses, a message carved in flesh and steel. Rome does not forgive. Back in Rome, his name had become a myth, a curse, and a promise. And then, in a twist no one expected, Sulla returned to Rome not just as a conqueror, but as a dictator, not a temporary one either. He declared himself dictator for the writing of laws and the reformation of the state. Absolute power. He didn't share power. Executed his enemies, silenced the Senate, and rewrote Rome itself. His enemies were hunted down one by one. Blood ran through the streets. The Republic gasped under his grip. And yet, when he had reshaped the world in his image, gave it all up. He resigned. Just like that. No one understood why. Some say it was arrogance. To prove he could walk away from power no one else would resist. Others believe he feared the monster he'd become. But one thing was certain: Sulla had changed Rome forever. He was the first to show that legions could control the Republic, that fear could govern better than law, that one man's will could bend history itself. But his story was not over yet, because the seeds he planted of violence, dictatorship, and ambition would soon sprout in others more dangerous than him. And Rome's bloodiest days were still ahead. Sulla returned to Rome not as a citizen, but as a storm. His legions entered the Eternal City with banners raised. And for the first time in Roman history, a Roman general marched against his own capital. Blood stained the cobbled streets as his enemies scrambled to flee. The Senate, once proud and defiant, now trembled in the shadow of the man they had exiled. But Sulla wasn't here for revenge alone. He was here to reshape Rome. He declared himself Dictator Re Publicae Constituente, dictator for the reformation of the Republic. It was a title not seen in centuries and never wielded with such brutality. Sulla, once an outlaw, now ruled without limit. His word was law, his justice was final, and his wrath was absolute. And then came the prescriptions. He ordered lists to be posted in the forum. Names of men declared enemies of the state. There were no trials, no defenses, no appeals. Anyone on the list was to be hunted down and killed. Their properties were seized, their families ruined, and their names erased from public memory. Hundreds died in the first days. Their heads were displayed on spikes in the forum, a grotesque reminder of Sulla's New Rome. Even wealthy equestrians and senators weren't spared. If Sulla wanted their lands, their gold, or their silence, he took it. One by one, his political enemies disappeared. Some fled to distant provinces, others hid in catacombs. Most were found, dragged into the streets, and butchered. But Sulla's cruelty wasn't chaos. It was calculated. Each name on the list served a purpose: eliminate opposition, reward loyalty, and fill the treasury. He offered bounties for the heads of the proscribed. Soldiers, neighbors, even family members turned on one another for silver. Sons betrayed fathers. Slaves murdered masters. In a Rome drenched in paranoia, trust became a liability. When the killing slowed, Sulla turned his attention to reform, stripped power from the tribunes, the voice of the people, reducing them to empty titles, doubled the size of the Senate, filling it with his allies. He restructured the courts, handing control to the aristocracy. The Republic, in theory, still stood. But it now wore the mask of Sulla. And yet too many, he was not a tyrant, but a savior. He restored order. He strengthened the state. He rebuilt temples, sponsored games, and lavished the people with bread and spectacle. The mob fed and entertained, cheered him in the streets. But beneath the surface, Rome was broken. The old balance between people and patricians had shattered. Fear governed the city more than law. And every rising politician now knew, if Sulla could take Rome with legions, so could they. Still, the most terrifying part of Sulla's story was not how he rose, but how he ended. In 79 BC, at the height of his power, he stunned the world. He abdicated, resigned the dictatorship, walked away from power, and retired to a villa near Naples. No assassins pursued him. No rival dared to take his place. He had built a Rome in his image, and now he simply stepped aside. But even in retirement, his presence loomed. He wrote his memoirs, laughed at his enemies, and reportedly said, "No friend ever served me, and no enemy ever wronged me, whom I have not repaid in full." He died peacefully, unlike so many he had condemned, and was buried with honors in the field of Mars. His epitaph read, "No better friend, no worse enemy." Sulla's legacy was not his reforms, nor his wealth, nor his victories. It was the precedent he set, that a general could defy the Senate, that fear could govern a republic, and that one man's will could outweigh the law. Julius Caesar, years later, would walk the same path, but Sulla carved it first in blood. Sulla stood on the steps of the Curia Hostilia, his shadow long in the blood-stained forum. The war was won. The Senate, cowed and trembling, had no choice but to name him Dictator Re Publicae Constituentia, position not held since the time of ancient kings. But unlike those past tyrants, Sulla did not claim to rule for 6 months. He ruled indefinitely. And with that title, he began to reshape Rome not through reforms or philosophy, but with a blade. His first act was not peace. It was vengeance. Sulla issued the infamous proscription list, names of those he deemed enemies of the state. But these weren't just rival generals or senators. Anyone, merchants, poets, young men from noble families, could find their name etched onto public walls. The reward? Share of their property? The cost of mercy? Death. Rome became a city of whispers and betrayal. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Sons reported fathers. The streets echoed not with speeches, but with executions. But Sulla was just getting started. He restructured the Senate, bloating it with his own loyalists. He passed laws that favored the aristocracy and crushed the power of the people's tribunes. Popular representation was no longer a threat. Democracy in Rome was gagged, bound and buried. He even walked into the temple of Jupiter, placed his sword beside the altar, and declared, "Rome is mine, not the gods, not the peoples." Republic was no longer a republic, but it was the countryside that bled the most. Sulla seized vast stretches of land and gave them to his soldiers. Entire communities were uprooted. Those who had once supported Marius were exiled or executed. In the hills of Etruria, entire villages vanished. His most brutal campaign, however, wasn't on the battlefield, it was psychological. Survivors of his enemies were forced to watch the decapitated heads of their loved ones nailed to the rostra, the city's public stage. Sulla would walk by them as if they were mere decorations. And yet, he saw himself not as a monster, but as Rome's savior. He wrote his memoirs, speaking of himself in third person, describing how he restored the dignity of the Senate and purged the rot. He praised his own discipline, his order, his reforms. He genuinely believed he was a builder, not a butcher. But the blood refused to wash off. Historians still debate his final years. Some say guilt crept into his bones. Others claim he died peacefully in his villa, surrounded by dancers and wine. But before his death, he did something no other dictator in Rome's history had done. He gave up power voluntarily. He stepped down, retired to the countryside, and let Rome rule itself again. Why was it a political move? A philosophical gesture? Or perhaps a final, twisted joke, knowing that the chaos he unleashed could never truly be reversed? Rome would never return to its old ways. Sulla's brutal legacy carved deep scars into the Republic's foundation. Future leaders would learn from his tactics. Julius Caesar, Augustus. Even modern tyrants look back at Sulla with cold admiration. Sulla had taught the world a terrifying truth. You don't need a crown to become king. You just need blood and enough men to spill it. And with that, the rivers of Rome ran red.